Welcome to the third part of the Habitat Makers series, The Abandoned Lot Transformed. I'm here in Minnetonka, Minnesota with Heather Holm, and we're going to look at how this restoration was done. It's a beautiful restoration here. Where do you begin?
One of the challenging things about this site was just how chock full it was of invasive species. I had lived in the neighborhood 15 years, but had never even attempted to walk on site. That was how difficult it was. What we did was try and get on site and try and figure out what native plants are growing here before we start removing the invasive species. We actually only found 5 native tree and shrub species on site, but those were a starting point. The very basics of what maybe a plant list could be developed into, of what would be appropriate to put back here.
And did you study other areas around here to try and figure that out?
Yeah, just living in the neighborhood for more than 15 years, I really had a good understanding of the different microhabitats and plant communities. And we have another park in the neighborhood we have been restoring. So that was very helpful and made it easy for me to understand what could this site be. We knew it wouldn't reflect or look like a remnant plant community, but it could be something that's still diverse and functional for pollinators and birds, or whatever sort of restoration goals we may have set to transform the site.
Let's say I'm a novice habitat maker. How would I even know where to acquire these plants?
It's pretty easy to find native plant nurseries now. Most states there should be at least one, and here in Minnesota we have over 20 native plant nurseries that specialize in growing native plants that are regionally appropriate. For my project, it was very easy to source plants. One of the things to keep in mind if you're a beginner habitat maker is you really need to have a good understanding of the site conditions. What is the soil type? How much sun does a particular area get? We planted very different plants along the pond versus what we planted on the hot road edge at the front of the property. So even a small property like this may be divided up into sort of subsections that have their own customized plant lists.
So when doing a restoration, I might be tempted to, let's say you're at your local nursery and you see, that's a beautiful plant. I'd love to have that in my restoration, but it's not native. What's the big deal about native plants?
Well, native plants are part of the local ecosystem. So when we plant plants that aren't native in our gardens or in a restoration, which wouldn't be a good idea, you're basically putting a plant that it doesn't have any connections with insects or with other fauna. And that's why native plants are really workhorses. They're combination of hosting a number of different caterpillars, providing the right nutrients, pollen and nectar for our native pollinators. Those two elements really form this foundation of a complex food web. So if we were to plant a landscape with all non-natives, we wouldn't have a functioning food web. And we're really trying to achieve in restorations, whether it's a small garden in a homeowner's property or a large-scale restoration, is functionality. How will it evolve over time? How many species may be supported by the landscape, and so on.
Can you talk to me maybe about some plant species that are here and how they function to really work as part of this ecosystem?
Yeah, so one of the primary goals was to create pollinator habitat here, and I really tried to select plants that supported rarer bee species. So for example, about 25% of native bees are actually pollen specialists. The females only collect pollen from a very narrow range of plants. It could be a single plant genus. For example, willow species. I planted willow on the pond edge. We've added sunflower species in the open savanna area in the middle section, and those are really workhorse plants. Not only do they support rare bees, but they also support a very large diversity of caterpillars. And caterpillars are one of the primary food sources for most terrestrial birds when they're feeding their offspring, their chicks. It's about providing really good food sources for these critical fauna in our food web.
Let's say you're a bird person and you have a multitude of bird feeders on your property. Isn't that doing the job?
Well, bird feeders are one small part of a bird's diet, and many bird species aren't seed eaters. So if a homeowner is just putting up bird feeders for birds, they aren't supplying the insects that are the critical protein source that they need to feed their chicks. So we need the plants in the landscape that are serving up those insects to feed the birds.
So if you like birds, you want diversity of birds, go native plants, right?
Exactly. It's fine to supplement your bird, putting up bird feeders to supplement birds' food sources in the fall and winter, and some people like to do it year-round. But we can't forget about that really critical component that insects are their primary food source.
Heather, I know you've written books on bees, that you're a pollinator conservationist. Do you think maybe there's a little bit of bias in what you've selected here?
Yep, I will admit I'm biased on this restoration. Biased in the sense that my goals were centered around pollinator habitat. But even if you are focusing on planting for pollinators at a site, you're still going to serve other organisms, birds, for example. There's plenty of overlap, particularly if you're really increasing the diversity of native plants. We also took into consideration things such as, do we have standing dead trees on the site? Because those standing dead trees can provide nesting cavities for birds, but they can also provide nesting opportunities for several types of pollinators. Even if you have one very narrow goal, it can really serve a broader purpose for different fauna.
So it all works together as a mini ecosystem, right?
It certainly does, yep.
We've talked a lot about pollinators and birds. What about other species, amphibians, reptiles, mammals?
Oh, we had a very exciting event not too long ago, a few weeks ago. A neighbor texted me who walks through here every day, and she said, "What is this animal that I just photographed in the pond in the corner lot?" And I couldn't believe it. She had witnessed 2 otters. I never would have anticipated that we would have otters coming to this small pond in the neighborhood.
So had the site not been restored, you might not have had people walking through here to even notice, right?
Oh, absolutely. Pre-restoration, this lot was so chock full of invasive species that you literally couldn't walk through here. And now we have neighbors walking through here daily. This has really become a local refuge for people, a place for them to reflect, to de-stress, and just to connect with nature. And also a living lab for the neighbors to watch this site transform over time.
You and your neighbors have brought this area from being one of a literal dead zone to great biodiversity. What has surprised you about what's happened here?
Probably one of the most surprising things was in a year and a half after we had removed the invasive species and started planting native plants, our state bee, which is an endangered bee species, the rusty patch bumblebee, showed up. And to me, that is amazing. That shows how resilient nature is and how doing something this small a scale can make a difference.
It seems like the saying, "If you build it, they will come," rings true here.
Absolutely. The rusty patch bumblebee is still observed here in Minnesota, but it's largely disappeared from its historical range. It used to occur in southern Canada and Ontario and all throughout the eastern US. So this is his last place that it's trying to survive and not go extinct. And I think of this as a small piece of the puzzle, the habitat piece that species like the rusty patch bumblebee need in order to thrive.
So I want to thank you for being a part of this series on the abandoned lot transformed. And I want to ask you, can we come back and visit this Oric Avenue restoration down the road?
Absolutely. I'm sure I'll have many new things to show you about what I've discovered here.
That'd be great. Thank you, Heather.
You're welcome.
And thank you for being part of the journey of the Habitat Makers series. Stay tuned for future episodes.